Okay, well, with any luck, I'm here. Thanks for bearing with me. Maybe it's going to be a really good show because I've had a tremendous amount of mishaps in the last 45 minutes. Thunderstorm, lost the internet connection, and then for some reason lost the camera just about 2 minutes ago, which is why I'm starting about a minute late. Thank you all for being here. I can't believe it. I feel so privileged that you guys are hanging in with me. I can't believe this is like what is Judaism Part 9. And as far as I can tell, there are going to be at least 2 other, maybe 3 other shows before I can get through with just the history of the religion. Anyway, a little housekeeping. First of all, I tried to turn up the sound. I don't like having it be too loud so that I clip. But I overdid it last time, and I think I was too low. I got some complaints, so I guess let me know on the chat if the sound is clipping or something, or if it's too low. And let's see, a couple of corrections. One which will make some of you, at least one of you, happy, I think. I have the great privilege of having at least one listener who is an extremely knowledgeable and erudite and, frankly, extremely famous Dominican theologian and priest. And he took issue, well, I shouldn't say he took issue with, that's not fair. He pointed out some potential historical errors that I made. As I said before, I fly by the seat of my pants a bit, and I'm not a real scholar in any one area, so I do make mistakes. So the quote that I attributed to St. Ambrose about hating the Jews, he suggested more accurately might be attributed to St. John Chrysostom. And I could not find that quote when I looked into the work that I have of St. Ambrose's writings. Now, it's not a complete collection, but nonetheless, I'm happy to acknowledge that that quote might have come from St. John Chrysostom, if you remember it. And similarly, I cited a canon from the Council of Nicaea, which is 4th century, and this very knowledgeable Dominican pointed out that that is a very unusual church council because the records were lost, actually, of the canons that were passed, and there are several collections of what are said to be the canons, and although the canon I cited was in one of those collections, it's not considered the most authoritative collection. And he thought that that canon might be from the Council of Nicaea, from the Council of Elvira a few centuries later. So I'm perfectly happy to make both of those corrections, and I will point out that fortunately I don't think either of those corrections actually have any impact on what was being said, so to speak. So, okay, I'm continuing with, oh my goodness. Oh, I put up the wrong, everything's going wrong. The title of today's show was not supposed to be Theological Developments, Emancipation to the Holocaust. It was actually supposed to be Hasidism. And Hasidism is one of the theological developments from emancipation to the Holocaust, but it isn't the only one. And I found that the material that I was going to try to cover was more than one show's work, so I decided to divide it up into the Hasidism aspect. Okay, so Hasidism. Now, I talked a lot in the last 2 shows about the Kabbalah as the origin of Hasidism, and I talked about the nature of especially Lurianic Kabbalah, which was the Kabbalah that took over and became basically the only Kabbalah in Europe. And just for fun, there's Isaac Luria again, the founder of Lurianic Kabbalah. And it really took Jewry by storm, and it really took European Jewry by storm. And in fact, European Jewry, in the days that we're talking about, which is essentially the 17th century, was primarily Eastern European. It was, in fact, I showed this slide before, but it was in the area that's around Poland. You see Poland up there in the upper right-hand side, and you see that there were a series of expulsions periodically for the past few hundred years, and the Jewish population tended to migrate towards Poland because it was actually the only area in Europe that rather consistently, from about the 13th century on, allowed Jews in there. Unfortunately, the reason why the noblemen, okay, we're talking about serfdom, we're talking about the 13th century, we're talking about lords who had huge tracts of land on which worked serfs who were almost slaves, not quite slaves, and they had to give most of their production to the lord, but the lord might have owned hundreds of square miles of territory. And so he actually invited the Jews in to a large extent to be what was called tax farmers. In other words, to be his agents collecting the rent from the serfs and collecting the percentage of their crops that belonged to the Lord and so forth. This didn't make the Jews very popular. I mean, no more popular than your local neighborhood IRS agent, actually less popular. And so there was a lot of resentment against them. There was a huge rebellion in 1648. Can I have it written down, the correct pronunciation? Chmielnicki, who was a Pole. No, he was a Ukrainian. And most of the land that's now the Ukraine was basically held by Polish nobles. And Chmielnicki launched his rebellion of essentially Ukrainians against the Poles, and the Jews were kind of not, they were worse than caught in the middle. They were actually the number one target because the Polish nobles weren't anywhere to be found, but the Jews were. And there was tremendous slaughter. So before this happened, before the Chmielnicki massacres, there were 3/4 of Europe's Jews were in that territory, and almost half of the Jews in that territory. In other words, I think it was like, oh boy, I keep forgetting the numbers off the top of my head. But in any case, about 45% of the Jews in that territory were wiped out during this 1 year period of pogroms, of massacres. I do have a slide of pogrom. Pogrom is the word for when a mob of soldiers or armed men would run through a Jewish town or a Jewish quarter and basically slaughter everyone in sight. You can't really see much in that slide, but I figured since I found it, I would pull it up. And that really set the table for both the false messiahs who arose in that time, which I spent last class talking about, particularly Sabbatai Zvi and Jacob Frank, because the Jews were so desperate. And it also opened the door to the emergence of Hasidism, which is where I'm going to go now. So Hasidism really began with one person, the Baal Shem Tov. I have a picture of him here. There he is. Why does he look a little bit gnomish to me? But anyway, the Baal Shem Tov, a tremendous, huge figure, the father of all Hasidism since then. So he was born, let me look up the date so I don't have to fake it, 1698. So we're talking about, for the last 300 years, all of the Hasidism in the world stemmed from his work, the Baal Shem Tov. Now, he was a Kabbalist. He started out as a Kabbalist, that's for sure. He ended up as a different kind of Kabbalist. The name Baal Shem Tov in itself is a reference to the Kabbalah, because if you remember from an earlier show, one of the sources of the magical abilities that the Kabbalists would get would be by manipulating and meditating on the unpronounceably holy name of God. The Yud He Vav He, or here I wrote JHWH, and there you have the Hebrew letters, the Tetragrammaton. And they would manipulate various permutations of the name of God and meditate on them to achieve both mystical states of consciousness and magical powers. Once you became a master of doing that, and were an initiate, so to speak, were able to achieve either magical results or higher states of consciousness, you were a master of the name. That's what Baal Shem means. It means master of the name. So that's where Baal Shem comes from. And Baal Shem Tov, Tov just means good. So he was the good master of the name. And conventionally, that's thought of referring to the fact that he was a particularly effective master of the name. So that's why he's the Baal Shem Tov. Now, as a master of the name, his business as a Kabbalist, before he became a major rabbinic figure, was to make amulets, magical amulets. I'm calling them magical amulets. I think they are magical amulets, but if one wanted to be super charitable, one might call them sacramental amulets or something. I mean, I'm wearing my brown scapula. I don't consider it a magical amulet. I consider it a sacramental. So if one wanted to be super charitable, maybe one could consider the amulets to be semi-sacramentals. Anyway, here is an example of one, which is actually an amulet for protection in childbirth. And I saw in the chat stream that somebody asked about the Star of David. Now, in fact, I'm not going to really talk about it today, but the Star of David was not much of a Jewish symbol, except in Kabbalah, until probably the 19th century, maybe 18th century. It was not a traditional symbol of Judaism until the late Middle Ages. It did, however, appear a fair amount in Kabbalah. Hence, you see it in this amulet. Now, that's an amulet for childbirth. I have a couple of other examples. That one looks quite sophisticated and neatly lettered. I don't know how recent it is. I have another one here, which looks a little bit more primitive, a little more authentic, in the sense of more likely to be what it would have looked like in the days of the Baal Shem Tov. And you guys know me, and you guys know that I'm terribly concerned about the coronavirus that is wreaking havoc. I think, 35% of Americans have already been killed by it? Oh no, I think it's 3/1000ths of 1%. Anyway, never mind. The Black Plague, by the way, wiped out 1/3 of Europe, okay? So what's that, 35%? And I do think this virus, it's around that. It's around 1/100ths of 1%, 200ths of 1%. Anyway, however, they were very concerned with it back in the days of the Baal Shem Tov. And you know that now we have to wear masks to protect ourselves. And it turned out that the Baal Shem Tov had developed this magical, mystical amulet mask to protect against coronavirus. So if you want to print it out, and maybe you can tape it behind your ears and use it, and I'm sure you'll be safe whenever you go into public places. Although I'm not sure that the guards who are keeping us polluters away will honor it. Anyway, there's my little political stab. What was his actual name, I see? His actual name was Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer. Israel ben Eliezer. But for 300 years, he's been known as the Baal Shem Tov. And even Baal Shem Tov isn't enough of a shorthand. He's known as the Besht, because that's the anagram from the first letter of Baal, Shem, and Tov, like B-S-H-T, the Besht. And so what was I going to say? Oh, yes. Now, somebody asked this in respect to a previous show. Baal is related to the god Baal in the Old Testament. Baal just means master. It just means master or Lord. So the Baals in the Old Testament, the lords, that's like gods, little g gods. So anyway, it is actually related. And Baal also means husband, actually. So it occurs in different contexts, including Baal Shem Tov. But it's not just a pure coincidence. Okay, now, what did he introduce? First of all, I will say he started out his career as a practical Kabbalist, making amulets and so forth, but by the end of his life, he renounced practical Kabbalah and all the magical and incantations and so forth. He did say were bad news. He definitely had charismatic gifts. There's a lot of legends about all of the things that he did. I am quite convinced, because I have seen it in more recent Hasidic rabbis, and I'll talk about some personal experiences I've had a little later in the show. I don't think it's unusual for them to have a gift, in some sense, of reading souls, of some kind of supernatural knowledge when they're guiding souls. There were a lot of healings attributed to him. I don't see any reason actually to doubt that. And he also was very loving and warm-hearted, which may in itself just be to some extent a charismatic gift. He certainly was very charismatic. He got a large following relatively early. And he settled, and I don't know if I'm making too much of this, but the town that he settled in is Medjugorje. Now, sounds like 2/3 of Medjugorje to me. I mean, the first two syllables are exactly the same. It's Medjugorje. So anyway, I don't know what to make of that, but I thought it was kind of cute when I realized that. Now, the center of his practice, okay, I'm just rambling. Let me focus in and say something that makes sense at some point. You know about the Talmud. You know about the Pharisees already in the days of Jesus. You know about how Judaism was always subject to being this mechanistic, rule-obeying practice of minutia of the law, to the extent that you kind of forgot about God, in a sense, forgot about worship, and were just concerned about what you could eat, when you could eat it, when you should pray, what direction you should face when you pray, and so forth. And the Baal Shem Tov's main shtick was, hey, wait a minute, guys, you're missing the boat. That's not what Judaism is about. That's not what religion is about. That's not what God is about. What religion is about and what true Judaism is about is, as Jesus said, loving the Lord God with all of your heart and all of your might and all of your soul, and your neighbor as yourself, especially the first half, loving God with your whole heart and your whole might and your whole soul. And there is one very famous Hasidic story that really impressed me when I was 13, when I was trying to struggle with all of the Hebrew of Hebrew prayers. And the story is that there is, I think it was a Yom Kippur service, the holiest day of the year. All of the Jews are going to shul, are going to synagogue in order to pray. And there's this poor Jewish peasant boy who just, he's a shepherd, and he spends all his time out in the field with sheep, and he was illiterate, and he couldn't read Hebrew, and he didn't know the prayers, but he loved God, so he's in the back of the synagogue feeling terrible that he can't worship God, and he decides to worship God the only way he knows, and he takes out his little flute, and he, with his whole heart, plays this very heartfelt melody to God, to praise him and to worship him with his flute. And I think it was the Baal Shem Tov, but in any case it was the Hasidic master, told this story and said that that boy's prayer was more pleasing to God than all of the other, learned rabbis' prayers in the synagogue that day. So that's really this in a nutshell. Now, the central theological concept in the Baal Shem Tov is called divukut, cleaving to God. That it's a direct connection with the divine. It's actually entering into communication or communion with God. I don't think it's equivalent to mystical union in the Catholic saint sense, but it's definitely a form of union with God. Devekut just means cleaving, and it's the desire to achieve a direct connection with the divine. Now, the way that they did it was, yes, there are the rote prayers. Rote is not a nice word, but the liturgical prayers that Jews were to say. But there was also joyful chanting. They would chant these melodies, simple melodies. They're called nigunim. That's a plural, a nigun. It's the same. It's almost the same verse chanted over and over and over again with a simple melody in a kind of ecstatic, charismatic way that lifts you up to God. And they would dance, also have these ecstatic dances, and be dancing as a form of worship to God, and just chanting these simple melodies with words. I'll go into my sordid history as a would-be Hasid later in the show, but the one I remember is Od Avinu Chai, the soul of our. I'm just drawing a blank. Anyway, our Lord lives. Am Yisroel Chai, the soul of Israel lives, over and over and over again. And oh boy, I'm just skipping around. But I'll skip around. I'll come back to the Baal Shem Tov. But let me move ahead 300 years, okay? This is a little bit of an experiment, the skipping around show. Let me show you the Hasidic rabbi who I fell into his entourage when I was 17. I thought this was the greatest thing in the world. I did think it was the greatest thing in the world. It was the greatest connection that I had to God up to that point in my life, was when I was a kind of disciple of his in his entourage. His name was Shlomo Carlebach. I have to scroll down way down for this. And he was a Lubavitcher Chabad rabbi. I'll be talking later in the show about who the Lubavitchers are, but they're a very large Hasidic community, Hasidic sect. And we're talking now the late 1960s, okay? So this is hippie days. And so here is Shlomo Carlebach. He would, his main ministry was to fallen away hippie Jews. Not exactly fallen away, but, hippie Jews who didn't take Judaism as seriously as they took hippiedom. And he had a large ministry to them. He actually had a house in San Francisco where they could stay, and he had an outreach to them, and I was snagged in his outreach. Now, let me see what other pictures I have of him. You don't need a whole lot of pictures of him. Somewhere I had a picture of him surrounded by hippies, but I forgot to put that on. But I will, if you forgive the low musical quality, I will show you what he was about by playing a little video clip, and it's kind of instrumental. Okay, well, I hope that music wasn't too discordant for your ears. I don't know if you could read the scrolling underneath, but the words of what he was singing were kind of charismatic. You know, how much God loves us and how you can pray without words and so forth. So that is, circa 1975 Hasidism aimed at hippies. Let me go back to the Baal Shem Tov and and kind of sober up a little bit. So I had talked about how it was about cleaving to God, about loving God with your whole heart, about doing everything over the course of the day, in the presence of God, actually. You know, that's a very beautiful Catholic and especially actually Eastern Orthodox devotion to practice the presence of God. It's amazing if you actually do that. If you simply remind yourself every 5 minutes that you are in the presence of God, that God is watching, that God is aware of what you are doing. That's why I'm doing this for you. You think I'm doing it for you. But I know that God's aware that I'm doing this. So anyway, if you do everything that you do for pleasing God, and if every time you do something that isn't pleasing to God, you realize that you did it in the presence of God, and therefore, you want to be contrite about it and apologize. That's a very, very powerful spiritual practice. And that's kind of reflected in, yes, Roy, I do need a producer. Boy, do I ever need a producer. Anyway, that's kind of reflected in this devekut, this cleaving to God. Now, that Shlomo Carlebach was, of course, 1975 version of this charismatic aspect of Hasidism, which was really what distinguished it, which was really what, it was breaking out of the shell. It was a little bit antinomian itself, by the way. I had used that word in the context of Sabbatized V, of kind of breaking the rules, being kind of iconoclastic. Hasidism was iconoclastic in the fact that people behaved without decorum. They danced, and I'll show you some Hasidic dance moves, so to speak. Okay, these are now, well, first I'll show you a classic Hasidic dance move, so to speak, which might have been from the days of the Baal Shem Tov. So there you have a Hasid dancing joyfully in a painting. And then moving to the present, we have a very similar scene here of Hasid in his joyful, ecstatic dance. Let's hope that he's doing it to the worship of God and not to show off his moves. I have no reason not to think he's doing it for the worship of God. And as I said, when I was with Shlomo Carlebach, I had a tremendous spiritual experience from these things. So that's that. There's, I can go on and on and on. There's another scene of Hasidic dance. There is another scene of Hasidic dance. You'll note, by the way, that it's not mixed dancing. The women do not dance with the men. So, okay, I showed you that, and I'll just show you this slightly older one. It actually shows a Hasidic rabbi in dance and his characteristic. The different Hasidic groups wear different characteristic clothes, and I will talk more about that later. And of course, this is a little bit reminiscent. This joyful Hasidic dancing is, of course, a little bit reminiscent of the charismatic renewal in the Catholic Church. So, for comparison's sake, I thought I would just show you, some wild-eyed charismatics there in a charismatic prayer meeting, raising up their hands and spontaneously and joyfully praising God. I don't know how much dancing went on there, although I would have loved to see it if that guy in white in the middle had broken out into some fast twirling. Anyway, I better get that off before I get in too much trouble. Okay, now the Hasidic movement was condemned for a number of reasons when it came out. One was actually, do I want to get into the dark underbelly? Let me put it this way: the conventional rabbis didn't like the competition that they were getting from the Hasidic rabbis, because the Hasidic rabbis tended to be more appealing to the people, and basically were more attractive spiritual leaders. The conventional rabbis tended to be doing it for the status and for the money that came with the job, and be less involved with the people. I mean, you see this. I mean, it's competition, right? I mean, remember Avis? We Try Harder, when Avis was number 2 and Hertz was number 1 in the car rental business. You see it in South America with the evangelical churches poaching on the Catholics, because, the Catholic priests very often are overwhelmed and have their routine and their responsibilities, and the charismatic pastors can pay more attention to the people and spend more time with them. You had some of that dynamic going on there. You had the fact that it was kind of scandalous going on there. But you also had the fact that it lended itself to serious apostasy. Because when you had these, Hasidic Jews just, pouring their heart out in singing and dancing, God, I want to know you more. God, come into my life. Like all of those good, contemporary Pentecost hymns, Holy Spirit hymns, like, right? Basically the God come into my life kind of business. Of course, it was opening them up to this other Jewish religious leader fellow, who of course stands at the door and knocks. And he was getting through, and many of them were apostatizing to Christianity because they were letting go of their desiccated, dried out focus on legalistic Judaism and turning instead to God, to our Lord and Master and Creator, and the Master of Divine Providence, and the one who loves us more than we love ourselves, and so forth. And of course, he responded, because he's always knocking on the door, and by their open-hearted desire to know God and to know the Messiah, because remember I talked a lot in the last show about how Lurianic Kabbalah was all about the Messiah. I mean, even in Jewish circles, they will say that. It's all about the Messiah. The Messiah is at the center of the theology and the worship and everything. So, of course, they're calling out to the Messiah. And so, of course, the Messiah answers. But he is perhaps not who the rabbis would have liked him to be, so to speak. So, good. I don't know how much trouble I've gotten into so far, but that's why I do these shows, is to get into trouble. So anyway, let me see if I have lost anything. No. Okay, they were very seriously opposed by, they're called the Mitnagdim. I can never say this. Mitnagdim, which just means opponents. They were opposed for a bunch of reasons, including what I said, was that they were the competition, they were the new guy in town, and they were undermining the status quo. And they were also condemned because of the apostasy to Christianity. So, and also, of course, I talked last time about the Sabbateans and the Frankists, these false messiahs who had arisen and led a lot of Jews astray. So there was also opposition because this kind of smelled of that, if you know what I mean, even though it wasn't really that. There was a kind of like putting them together in the same category. Okay, now I will. I think I'll move on from there. I'm moving very fast, actually. That's uncharacteristic of me. Okay, so we had the Baal Shem Tov. Let me go back to the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht. That was his portrait. And this is his house and synagogue, which stayed there in Medjugorje. Somebody in this chat stream pointed out that Medju means in the middle of, so Medjugorje I think means in the middle of the mountain, so I don't know what Bisht is. But that is his house, and I believe his synagogue also, and which lasted until 1915, I believe, when it was destroyed. It's been rebuilt, but this is a photograph of the original. And this is what had been his gravestone. I believe it's been replaced with a newer gravestone. You can see in the letters there in the second line what looks like a worn out Baal Shem Tov. And I think it was replaced when, I believe, I don't really know the history, but this is his tomb now. It gets many, many visitors. And this is obviously a newly built tomb, and the photographs from inside suggest that he's got a replacement new tombstone. And if you read the Hebrew letters up top, you can see it says Baal Shem Tov in the largest Hebrew letters on the top. So that is the Baal Shem Tov. Now, as I said, there is, he lived, I didn't even give you his dates. His dates were 1698 to 1760. As I said, his given name was Rabbi, not his given name, but you know what I mean, Israel ben Eliezer. By the way, in case you didn't know this, all Jewish names were just patronymics. In other words, you got your name. My name was Naphtali. I mean, you just got a first name. And your last name was son of your father's first name. So Israel ben Eliezer just means Israel, the son of Eliezer. I was Naphtali ben Mordechai, Naphtali the son of Mordechai. There were no last names in the sense that a father and the son would have the same last name. The last names were only introduced when the Jews were put under the authority of the German, I'm thinking of Germany because that's where my family's from, the German government. They were assigned last names by the town clerk, which is why, by the way, many German Jews have really repulsive last names, like Pinkwater or Blackhead, like a pimple, and so forth, is because if the clerk was anti-Semitic and a Jew came in and had to be assigned a last name, he could give him any last name he wanted. So, if their last name is Money Grubber or, Pimple Face or something, it wasn't necessarily because they were very pimply or that they were a money grubber. It was the name that was assigned to them. I wasn't talking about that. That was Israel ben Eliezer. Okay, so let me get some years here. Within 70 years after the Baal Shem Tov's death, there were hundreds of thousands of Hasidim in Eastern Europe, in the same area. They were in dozens of sects, let's call them sects. What would happen is that they would be formed in different towns under a different charismatic Hasidic rabbi, and then that charismatic Hasidic rabbi would pass on the headship of that denomination or sect of Hasidism to his son, sometimes to his son-in-law if he only had a daughter, and it would be passed down through the generations. Therefore, they are referred to as dynasties, because they are dynasties. They're also referred to as courts. And there were hundreds of thousands of Hasids, as I said, 70 years after the Baal Shem Tov's death. There are today, I would say, 750,000, maybe 1 million Hasids. It's measured in households, and there are 130 130,000 Hasidic households. So if you figure 5 or 6, they have a lot of children. They're like Catholics are supposed to be in that. Be fruitful and multiply. The greatest mitzvah you can do is to have children and raise them up for God. By the way, that's true of Catholics also. The greatest mitzvah, that's good deed you can do, pleasing to God, is to have children and raise them up to be with Him for all eternity, to love Him and be loved by Him for all eternity. Unless you're religious, that is, I believe, I don't want to get in too much trouble, the highest calling of a Catholic layperson. Because that's why God created the universe. God created, I've said this before, but He created the whole universe, Never mind the Milky Way. The Milky Way is a small galaxy, right? The entire universe, it's not infinitely large, but it's continually expanding. The Milky Way is a tiny speck in the universe. The solar system is a tiny speck in the Milky Way. We're a tiny speck in the solar system, and yet it was all created for one thing, which is so that we would help cooperate with God in creating eternal, immortal human souls. Maybe eternal isn't the word, but immortal human souls to make it to heaven, for God to love for all eternity and to be loved by for all eternity. And that's why God bothered with everything else. So the Jews have that right. And so they tend to be large families, so that 130,000 may well be around 750,000 to 1 million Hasidic Jews. Now they are divided into courts or dynasties or sects, and there are about 10 large ones and about 20. What century did last names come into being? That depends on when the government basically took over. I would say in Germany, I would put it at the first half of the 19th century for the Jews. I would guess it came perhaps later in Eastern Europe. In Scandinavia, I believe maybe Finland still has patronymics. Russia had patronymics. That's the word when last name is your father's name. Very late, I believe, into the 20th century. This idea of family names is a relatively new development. Anyway, the sects. There are maybe about 10 large ones, about 25 smaller ones around the world now, mostly, of course, in Israel and the United States and Europe, not Eastern Europe or Russia. I think they did not survive the Holocaust and communism. And I have some lists here, not that anyone is going to really read them, but just to show the basic idea. This is a list of the larger sects. I think you see there about 8 there, or 9. They're generally named after the town where they developed. So Belz is named after the town Belz in Galatia. Lubavitch is named after the town in Russia, Lubyavitch, where they were founded, and so forth. You can see there, you see the founder. They were mostly founded in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of them are headquartered, looks like they're headquartered in either Israel or Brooklyn, our kind of contemporary Western Israel, or more Western Israel, Brooklyn. There are a lot of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn. So there you have the larger dynasties. And then I have a slide of the smaller dynasties. Oh, I think that went up by itself. Yes, that went up by itself. I can't come close to reading that, but it's got the same kind of information on it. And let me get me back here, if I can manage that. Okay. And now the clothing of Hasids is very distinctive and very characteristic of Hasids. The differences between the clothing depends on which sect they belong in. All of the clothing, by the way, is basically the clothing of Polish nobles at the time that the Hasidic sect was founded. So it doesn't have intrinsically religious meaning. It's that, it's sort of like the Amish. These Hasidic sects were kind of frozen in time when they were founded. So since the leader of the sect... Everyone, please shut off your cell phones. The leaders of the sects would wear the nice clothing of the nobles at the time. That became the clothing of the sect. And it hasn't changed for whatever, those 250 years. So that's why they have the distinctive clothing. Just for fun, I have some of that here. The fur hats. Whoops, that's me. That's not what I wanted. What is going on here? There. The fur hat, of course, makes a lot of sense, probably a lot more sense in the Ukraine in winter than it does in Jerusalem or even in Brooklyn in the summer. But you can see the Eastern European heritage, so to speak. There you have, it looks like it's in Brooklyn, a group of Hasids walking down the street. Those fur hats, by the way, can be hideously expensive. The prayer shawls, the external prayer shawls, are probably an indication that the Hasid is going to shul, is going to synagogue to pray. Since driving in a car is forbidden under Jewish law on the Sabbath or on the holidays during which you're not supposed to work also, basically all the days that you're not supposed to work, which is Sabbath and holidays, all observant Jews basically live within walking distance of their synagogues. So that's why you very often see them, especially on Saturday morning, walking in their synagogue clothes in the street, is because they're walking, in fact, to synagogue. This is a typical Saturday morning sight of young Hasidic family walking to shul. And any differences there are, all of these actually look like they're the same sect, but there are differences in the hats, there are differences in other aspects of the clothing, but it's a little bit esoteric. Now, I mean, in other words, you might have to be another Hasid to really think they look very different. To us, they probably all look alike. So okay, let me pull myself up here since I think I'm supposed to be doing that. Okay, I hope Roy will speak. Yes. Okay, Zionism, Hasidism and Zionism. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you for reminding me about that. By the way, I see someone talking about Iceland. If I'm not mistaken, in Iceland, women are named after their mothers. So they are like Karen, the daughter of Susan. I could be mistaken there, but I believe that's the case. Anyway, yes, Kristen's daughter, right? That's the last name. Anyway, going on. When Zionism emerged in the late 19th century, it was opposed by probably most Hasidic groups. Many of them have changed their stance with the success of Zionism, in other words, with the formation of the State of Israel. But the largest single Hasidic group is the Satmar. And if I'm not mistaken, the Satmars are still, in principle, opposed to Zionism. That doesn't mean they don't live in Israel, but it means that they think that Zionism is a bad idea and they won't put their support behind Zionism. The Lubavitchers, who are the sect that I'm most familiar with, because they are the most open to outsiders, outsiders being defined as outsider Jews, Jewish outsiders. They're pretty much the only Hasidic sect that had a concerted outreach to non-Hasidic Jews. Many of the others kind of had contempt for non-Hasidic Jews, actually, considered they weren't really Jews. especially if they looked like me and, didn't keep strictly kosher and so forth. But the Lubavitchers always, I shouldn't say always, but certainly in this century, had a very strong focus on reaching out to non-Hasidic Jews. So the Lubavitchers are by far the most familiar to me, and they are Zionist. I don't know if they were always Zionists, but they definitely are Zionists now. So there's definitely dissension in the Hasidic ranks about Zionism. The idea being, going back to the 19th century when Zionism emerged as a kind of a religious political movement, the theological perspective was we're supposed to wait for the Messiah to come. The Messiah is supposed to come and restore the nation of Israel and move us all back to Israel. So we're not supposed to jump the gun and do that as a human effort, as a human initiative. We're supposed to be waiting for the Messiah and praying for the Messiah. It's like of human origin if we create a state of Israel or move to Israel and so forth. So that was basically the theology of it. In fact, there was a tremendous contention about using Hebrew in the new state of Israel, because Hebrew was a theological language. It was the language that God spoke. It's the language that you use for holy things. The idea of going to the dry cleaner and dropping off your clothes and saying, I need them back by Thursday in Hebrew was sacrilegious. Much less, God forbid, picking up a woman in a bar in Hebrew was sacrilegious. This was supposed to be a holy language, reserved for holy things. So that also meant that the idea of founding a modern state in which Hebrew would be the daily secular street language, did not seem kosher to these people. I would like to know, by the way, maybe I'll look into it. My suspicion is that the reason why Aramaic was the street language in the days of Jesus rather than Hebrew was the same thing, was that Hebrew was the liturgical language, and it was more proper to have to reserve it for liturgical use. But don't quote me on that. I'll have to verify that. Okay. Anything else I was going to talk about? The Satmar are the largest, and they are 26,000 households, and they are anti-Zionist. The Lubavitchers are, I believe, the second largest, and they're about 17,000 households, and they are pro-Zionist. And I mentioned that in my life, the Hasids that I have known have been primarily Lubavitchers. I think I kind of tell the story. I do work with Hasidic Jews, bring them into the church, by the way. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I love working with Hasidic Jews. And I have been instrumental in several of them entering the Catholic Church. There was one Hasidic Jew in Brooklyn who I suspect was not Lubavitch, but I don't know for a fact. And he got my name from the Mother Superior of a convent near where he lived, because he was always praying before the Blessed Sacrament exposed. The convent has perpetual adoration. And he was just drawn to pray all day, every Sabbath, in front of the Blessed Sacrament exposed. And he came to a complete faith in Jesus and faith in Christ and faith in the Catholic Church and belief in the real presence in the Eucharist. He was much, I don't know how to put it, but he was much more devoutly Catholic inside than I am. And the Mother Superior, he would talk to the Mother Superior. And the Mother Superior knows me. And so she put him in touch with me because he wanted to find another Jew who had entered the Catholic Church who he could talk to, because every Jew who's interested in the Catholic Church has to find a Jew, because nobody else understands, the situation that we're in. So he was dying to find another Jew to talk to who had entered the Catholic Church. She put him in touch with me. I won't even give his first name because he's terrified of being outed. Because if he's outed, he loses his family. His wife will divorce him, and the rabbi will give his wife custody of the children. He'll be kicked out of where he lives, he'll be kicked out of his job, and worst of all, he'll be kicked out of his wife and children, family. So I will not even mention his first name. I'll call him Shmuel. That's not his first name, Shmuel. Okay, so Shmuel calls me because he's dying to find another Jew who's entered the Catholic Church that he can talk to. So he says, I can't do his Brooklyn accent, but he says, where did you grow up? Englewood, New Jersey. Oh, what was your family? What was your synagogue? What was your shul? What was your rabbi? Well, it was a conservative synagogue. The rabbi says, you're not a Jew. I have to talk to a Jew. Really. I mean, end of negotiation, end of ministry to him, because I wasn't a Jew, because I was not, ultra-orthodox or Hasidic. Fortunately, I have a friend who is ultra-orthodox. So I said, okay, I'll put you in touch with so-and-so. And she got in touch with him, or he got in touch with her. And I don't know where he is now, but she was very, very helpful to him because, she was a real Jew. So anyway, that's a little side story. Okay, now the Hasidic Jews, yes, they follow all the laws. They have separate seating in the synagogue, the men and the women, usually on a separate floor. The women at least used to always be up in the balcony. Sometimes they have partitions, the idea being that the men should not be distracted by looking at the women, or the women shouldn't be, trying to be attractive to the men or whatever. Everyone's focus should be on God. It's not such a terrible thing, actually. There are very strong laws of ritual purity, which make it very... Yes, my radio guest, Marie, was she Hasidic? I always called her Hasidic, but she was not a member of a Hasidic sect. So she called herself ultra-orthodox. She followed the laws as much as a Hasid, but she was not a member of one of these dynasties, one of these clans. I believe she was a Baal Tshuva. I think she was a convert to ultra-orthodoxy, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, main line. Yes, the ritual purity. This makes them very standoffish because they will become ritually impure if they touch a woman who is in her monthly cycle. And they can't know whether or not a woman is in her monthly cycle or not, unless it's their wife or a very close member of the family. So they can't touch any woman outside of their wife. And so if a woman goes to shake their hand or tries to pat them on the shoulder or something, they will recoil with horror, which tends to make them seem very standoffish. They can't eat food that's prepared by anyone who isn't also as strictly kosher as they are. And in fact, the different sects might even have different little twists to their laws of kosherness. Kashrut is the word. So it makes them quite insular. And I've mentioned before, they can't drive on Sabbath, they can't use electricity, they can't turn electricity on. I believe if a light's been turned on before Sabbath, they can use the light. Same thing with an oven, I believe. If it was lit before Sabbath, they can use it, but they can't light the oven. They can't push the button on the elevator, so they can't live in a normal building with normal elevators unless they can walk up the stairs on Sabbath, and so forth. Anyway, a lot of very particular rules. Many of the rules, not all of them, many of them rules coming from the Old Testament, so they may seem silly to us, but take it up with God because they come from God. Some of the rules are interpretations made by rabbis that appear in the Talmud, in the Jewish oral tradition, so those you can make more fun of, so to speak, because those are definitely man-made. Remember, lest anyone, and also some people may be watching this show but not have watched other shows, and I don't want to be accused of being a Judaizer and supporting Judaism as a valid religion. So remember, here is my, I don't know how to put it, stamped on my forehead, okay? This is my tattoo. Temple Judaism, given by God in the Old Testament to the Jews, for the Jews, only for the Jews, to enable the Messiah to come. religion of divine origin. Completed Judaism, the Catholic Church, given by God to all of humanity for their salvation and their happiness, instituted by Jesus Christ, born on Pentecost Sunday, brought into being by Jesus' incarnation, life, passion, and death, the completion of Judaism, the fulfillment of Judaism, the God-given religion for all of mankind that started in 33 AD, Temple Judaism, the God-given religion for just the Jews that started about 2000 BC, ended about 33 AD, Rabbinic Judaism, a man-made religion to be the continuation of Judaism if you didn't want to follow it the way that God continued it into Jesus Christ. A man-made religion standing in between Temple Judaism and completed Judaism and hijacking and waylaying the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years, so to speak. So there, that's my little preaching. But I just wanted to make clear that I'm not confused about Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, still being a sacramental salvific religion. Okay, so back to Rabbinic Judaism. So, okay, I'm going to get into my Shlomo story. You'll have to tell me, I don't know whether it's good or bad to get kind of personal, but here I am, I'm 17 or 16. No, I just turned 17. I'm very in love with God. I was going to religious education all the way through high school. And the last 3 years or 4 years of high school, I think it was the last 3 years, so 10th, 11th, 12th grade, in my religious education, I had basically one main religious education teacher. His name in those days was Artie Green, and he considered himself a kind of hippie Hasid. I'll talk more about him later. So anyway, I'm very into this. I have this tremendous love of God and a kind of frustrated love of prayer. And on Purim, I go to my synagogue, which is led by another rabbi that I'll do half a show on, named Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, because he's also, I will say this is just weird, and it's providence. The three rabbis behind my formation in Judaism were in sequence Artie Green, who at the time was a seminarian, Shlomo Carlebach, and Arthur Hertzberg, who was my hometown rabbi. They are three of the most important rabbis in American Jewry in the 20th century, no joke. Artie Green, who was a seminarian when he was my religion teacher for 3 years, and my mentor for my college years after that, became the dean of the largest rabbinical seminary in the United States. And they actually started a new seminary for him to be the founding president of. Okay, he big shot. Shlomo Carlebach is still talked about today and still has a big following today. He must have died about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. He's a huge figure in Hasidic Judaism today. And Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg was the biggest political conventional rabbi in the United States for about 30, 40 years. He was the rabbi that Jimmy Carter would have to the White House to talk about Jewish issues, or Richard Nixon would have to the White House to talk about Jewish issues, or Golda Meir would, invite for, Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel for a really long time, would talk to about what's going on in the United States. He was the president of the American Jewish Congress and so forth. They just happened. They just happened to be my Jewish gurus, so to speak. So something must have been going on. Okay. Anyway, but I'm on Shlomo. Where was I? Was on Shlomo Carlebach at the moment. So Shlomo Carlebach, I played you that little video. I was just went to Purim service when I was 17, just turned 17. The synagogue had invited this weird guy, Shlomo Carlebach, to preach and have a charismatic service, presumably. The Purim service is intrinsically charismatic. It's very joyful and loud and so forth. So I show up at synagogue. I late, actually, because I had an after-school job, an evening job. And I am enthralled. There is this not really hippie. He just looked like an old man to me. But, the semi-long-haired, bearded, Hasidic rabbi dancing and singing and playing the guitar and having the kids get up and dance in circles and chant, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu, O Davinu, O Davinu Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael Chai, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai, over and over and over again. And there was such a love of God, and there was such a joy, and there was such a freedom from the stupidity of synagogue worship. The sterility, the formulaic business, the tight ties, the tight shoes, the uncomfortable suits, the sitting still in your seats, the boring stuff going on. This was really just wonderful. I was in seventh heaven. I didn't want to go home. I didn't go home. I followed some of the other disciples of his back to New York City. I must have called my mother before cell phones, but I must have called my parents to say where I was. And I slept on somebody's floor in New York. I think it was a Columbia University student or whatever, in this wonderful warm bath of this Jewish neo-Hasidic love of God. And then that summer, I went to Israel, as many Jewish teenagers did in those days. I just got off the plane to bum around in Israel, to go to a kibbutz, to do what Jewish teenagers did. But I pretty quickly met up with Shlomo Carlebach. I don't remember how, where I ran into some followers of his. But anyway, so then that summer I spent in his entourage, dancing with him and singing with him and sleeping on floors with the other disciples of his or whatever they were, getting yelled at by the straighter Hasidim. Lots of stories, and I was flying high. It was really a charismatic renewal. It was really that joy-filled, I will say Holy Spirit-filled, but please don't shoot me if that's technically incorrect, because I wasn't in a state of grace. But this tremendous, coming up from the heart, joyful love of God. I remember one night bicycling back to where I was staying from a prayer meeting, and just bicycling through the streets of Jerusalem at midnight, or Tel Aviv, might have been Tel Aviv, singing over and over again at the top of my lungs, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu Chai, O Davinu Chai, and so forth. Anyway, it was great. There was really something spiritual going on. And then I came back to the United States. I started going to MIT. I hung on to it for a year and a half in diminishing quantities and so forth, and kind of slid back into the old ways. Now, Shlomo Carlebach, I will say two things about him. Maybe I'll say three things about him. The first thing I'll say about him is he did have charismatic gifts. I will not deny that. He had charismatic gifts. I know this is a very small, low-level charismatic gift, but when I was in Israel, I was traveling for a while with a young woman. I was 17. I think she was 17. We were hitchhiking around. I took her to one of his prayer meetings. And he looked at her and he said, I remember you. You were at the prayer meeting in Scranton, Pennsylvania, March of last year. Now, he would have hundreds of kids at his prayer meetings, at colleges and college campuses and so forth. And he would have many a week, 3 or 4 a week. And he not only remembered having seen her, but remembered when and where he saw her. Now, she was cute, but she wasn't that cute, I mean, his memory was very interesting in that way. I think he had other charismatic gifts. I will say something else, which is, he fell. He was, I don't want to say he was a child molester. That's a little bit too harsh. But he misbehaved quite seriously with young women, sometimes, legal age, early 20s, but as early as 13. There was a lot have come forward. It became a big scandal. And there are plenty of witness testimonies on the internet of girls who at 12 or 13 were molested by Shlomo Carlebach. Not molested to the point of, naked with your clothes off kind of stuff, but pretty seriously molested nonetheless. I won't go into details. You can find their witness testimonies if you really want to. And it became almost a joke. It became quite notorious to at a point where, young women would say, don't get within 6 feet of him, or, keep your distance and so forth. And then he got married. I don't know what happened after he got married, but he got pretty written off in a lot of circles for that. It became pretty bad. And there's a reason which you'll see why I'm bringing this up. But let me cut to the chase and say we have seen the sex abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. And it's really bad. It's really bad. But it's not unique to the Catholic Church. And of course, there's a lot of terrible sex abuse in the public schools, teachers on students. But it's particularly prevalent in religious circles. And I think that's because, the devil's most interested in situations where God is involved. And he's most interested in sabotaging work for God, which means he's most interested in tempting, seriously, people who are doing good work for God. So plenty of stories of, huge televangelists, sex scandals about them. Hindu gurus, by the way, tons and tons and tons. And also Jewish rabbis. And in the ultra-orthodox community, in the conventional Hasidic community, and in these neo-Hasidic, whatever you want to call them, some kind of new, hip Hasidic movements. So no one can be on their high horse, and it doesn't have anything to do with the Catholic Church. If it has anything to do with the Catholic Church, the only thing it has to do with the Catholic Church is as obnoxious to the devil as Shlomo Carlebach might have been being by getting young Jews to think more seriously about God. It doesn't hold a candle to how obnoxious to the devil the true Catholic Church and the, reverent celebration of the sacraments are to the devil. So, of course, if the devil has 1,000 guns aimed at Shlomo Carlebach, he's going to have 100,000 howitzers aimed at a good priest. So anyway, I better move forward because I am wasting time. Shlomo, okay, I can't bypass this. The head of the Lubavitchers, all of the Hasidic sects consider their charismatic rabbis to be saints and wonder workers. That just comes with the territory. And they all pray to them. So none of this nonsense from Protestants that it's un-Jewish to pray for intercession. All Jews just pray directly to God. Not at all true. In Hasidism, it is very, very typical that if a Hasidic Jew is serious about wanting a prayer answered, he prays through the intercession of his rabbi, his founding rabbi like the Baal Shem Tov, or one of the great Kabbalistic rabbis and so forth. The Kabbalistic rabbis' tombs, and I have pictures of that somewhere here. So, the Kabbalistic rabbis' tombs in Israel have thousands and thousands of people who come to them every week, sometimes like 130,000 at once. I mentioned that at this tomb on a particular day, on the day of his death, actually, on this feast day. This is Rashbi's tomb. He's like the founder of Kabbalah. To pray for their intercession. This is obviously pre-Hasidic. This is just Kabbalistic. Isaac Luria, that I started the show with, the founder of Lurianic Kabbalah. Here's his tomb, and Hasids praying at his tomb. This must have been a random day, because again, there are days when you can't get near there because it's a special day. And the head of the Lubavitchers today is, not today, but he died, 20 years ago. I'll look up his date. When did he die? I better get that right. This is like real important. I don't think I even wrote it down. Let's say he died about 20 years ago. I'm not exactly sure. Rabbi Schneerson. This is his tomb. Now, those, that's not confetti. And it didn't rain, Post-it notes the night before. Those are prayer intentions. Those are the tombs of two Rabbi Schneersons, the one who passed away about 20 years ago, and his father. So anyway, just to show how Hasidic leaders of the sects are considered saints, and they're prayed to as saints for their intercession. Now, I'm going to respond, excuse me, I hope I don't make enemies, but I just saw a chat that says Catholic abuse is mainly in straight conservative circles. And I would challenge that. I mean, there's an issue of when things come to light, but I don't think that's actually true. I think it runs the gamut. There's been a recent horrible scandal in the SSPX. I don't know if you know about that. And I think there are horrible scandals in the touchy-feely, I'm okay, you're okay Catholic circles too. But anyway, I shouldn't keep getting distracted. Okay, so the Schneerson, I feel like saying, can someone remind me of the year he died? Anyway, I'm not going to stop myself, and I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm going to say 20 years ago and just go run with it, even though I know it's not true. There is a picture of Rabbi Schneerson. And after his death, there was a schism in the Hasidic community because so many Hasids thought that he was the Messiah, that they started kind of worshiping him as not worshiping as the Messiah. That's not fair to say, because they don't even know the Messiah is to be worshipped. But thinking that the Messiah has come and that Rabbi Schneerson was the Messiah. So in that light, let me show you a billboard from the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City. Moshiach is here. That's a picture of Schneerson, put up by Lubavitcher Hasids who think that he was the Messiah. And this is a really, really, really big deal. Let me see if I have other pictures that I was planning to pull up here. This is a kind of a zooming in on the billboard itself. Moshiach is here. Moshiach's Messiah. I think you know that by now. Just add in goodness and kindness. Long live the Rebbe, King Messiah forever. Okay. That is, I'm sorry, but if that's the Messiah, I'm looking for a screen which I well, never mind. Come on, he doesn't really do well compared to Jesus. So that's that screen. Here's another. I don't know if that's the billboard. It looks like it's probably a billboard. Moshiach is coming now. And on and on and on and on and on. Now, this is his house. in Brooklyn. It's known as 770. That's his address. It's 770 Eastern Parkway. Note the brownstone in the middle. You'll see that those are Hasids on the sidewalk. 770. Rabbi Schneerson's house in Brooklyn. Now, what do you do if he was the Messiah, and you're a community of followers of his in Jerusalem? Well, I guess you build a replica of his house from Brooklyn in Jerusalem, and that's what that is. That is not photoshopped. That is 1994. Thank you very much. I knew that someone would. So it's 26 years ago now, or 25 years ago now. He died. Okay, that is not a Photoshop. That is a exact replica. I'm not sure if it's to scale or not, of his house at 770 Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn, in Jerusalem. And what you do if you're a follower of his in Brazil, in Sao Paulo? Well, I guess if your property is in the middle of high rises in Sao Paulo, you build a slightly squished replica of 770 Eastern Parkway in Sao Paulo. Okay, and if you're followers of his in a Chabad community outside of Jerusalem named Kfar Chabad, Camp Chabad, because it's Chabad, you build a replica of 770 Eastern Parkway in the middle of the fields there. Okay, so now that is what you do if Schneerson is the Messiah. Now, lest we as Catholics feel at some kind of competitive disadvantage, let me point out that even though our Messiah came over 2,000 years ago, we not only have replicas of his house, but we still have his original house. That's the Holy House of Loretto, in Loretto. That's the interior, okay? That is, most Catholics, including me, believe, transported miraculously. There is a hypothesis that it was transported by crusaders and reassembled. I'm not going to get into that. But transported from Nazareth, and it was the house of Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And if I can toot my own horn, I will say it is one of the places, it's probably the classiest place I've ever been thrown out of. I did a pilgrimage to Loretto. I spent a couple of days pretty much in that house praying. And after a couple of days, whatever it is, the guard or the sacristan or whatever said, please, you've had your time. But I always would leave when a crowd came, so I don't think that was fair. I never took the space from someone else. If a group came or if a crowd came, I left the house itself and just went out in the basilica and only went back in when it was empty. So I think that was really unfair. But in any case, I was kicked out of there. It was probably the classiest place I was ever kicked out of, and it is in the outside of that house, the house itself. Of course, they put a beautiful ornamental shell around, and then they built a beautiful basilica around that. So that's actually the basilica in Loretto. But excavations done in Nazareth in Israel show that the footprint of the Holy House of Loretto exactly matches the foundation. I don't know exactly the technical term, but the foundation square of the excavation of the house in Nazareth. So if you want another version of the house of the true Messiah, that is the Annunciation Cave in Nazareth. You can go there. It's, of course, in the middle of a big basilica, but in the lower level of the basilica, they have built a basilica over and around the Annunciation Cave. That's the Annunciation Cave. If you see the altar there, you see that there is a marble ring at the base of the altar, and inside that marble ring, there is a piece of marble, and it says, Hic verbum caro factum est, if I have it right. Here the Word became flesh. That is the true Messiah's house. And of course, not only whenever I take a pilgrimage to Israel, of course we would go to Nazareth, but I have taken to actually staying in Nazareth, because the advantage of staying in Nazareth is we stay in a religious house across the street, and we can go over to the basilica basically just before it closes, 7 p.m. at night, 8 p.m. at night, and be all alone in front of that hic verbum caro factum est. All alone in silence in the empty basilica, because all the tour groups have left, and just be on your knees and pray there. And the same thing early in the morning when it opens. And that you can only do if you're staying there. And so this is horribly, of course, self-serving. But there is a picture of me. You can tell by how bald I am and how gray my, what's that religious ring, my tonsure is, that's a relative picture of me kneeling. The cave there usually has an iron grate keeping people from entering. Once in a blue moon, one can enter. But it's getting rarer and rarer every year. I have been inside, and I've actually been inside for Mass, but every year it gets harder and harder to get inside. But that is the real birthplace of the Messiah, and the real Messiah's home. That's not the birthplace, never mind. That's the home of the Messiah. That's where he was conceived. That's not, and the Holy House of Loreto is where his home was. Of course, his birthplace is Bethlehem, so that's something else. So anyway, that's my little ha-ha. I mean, how thin. Where, let me find the, here's the other thing. You know, how thin is Rabbi Schneerson for Messiah compared to this guy? I mean, come on, guys. So let's see. So back to the talk. How much time do I have? Oh, I only have about 15 minutes. Okay, so I will just breeze straight ahead. I showed you Shlomo Carlebach. Let me come here. I showed you Shlomo Carlebach. I will go ahead. I showed you Schneerson and the cult around him as Messiah. All of this should generate prayer, right? I mean, really. How can your hearts not go out to these guys? Right? I mean, this is what they have instead of that. Or that is what they have instead of this. I mean, really. But there's something even worse than Hasidism, even worse than Shlomo Carlebach, if I can say so. And so I'm going to end the show with this. The new Hasidism. Now, that's 2 copies of this guy's book. That guy there wearing the yarmulke and grinning, that's Artie Green. That is the guy who was my #1 theology teacher, Hebrew school teacher for at least 3 years of 10th, 11th, 12th grade of high school, maybe 9th grade, I don't remember. My freshman, sophomore, junior year of college, you know, I was in his entourage, so to speak. He was my new guru, Jewish guru. And he introduced this thing called a new Hasidism. He was kind of like making up his own version of Hasidism, and it took off. And I am going to show you a picture of him, because to tell the truth, I chose that picture because he wasn't a good guy. I mean, I thought, of course, he walked on water when I was a follower of his. But he misbehaved badly. I'm going to play an 80-second clip of his theology in his voice. So here is him explaining his theology, and I hope it's horrifying to you as it is to me. Whoops. Whoops, whoops, whoops. It didn't go out, did it? Okay, let me try that again. Okay, I think that was a total bust. So let me just try to play it in another way, and I don't know if I'll be able to even tell if it works. Okay, let's see if this works.
God is real. It's the center of life. This use of the word God has very little to do with the way most people understand the term, and sometimes you almost feel it should be a different word. But the language of God, of course, is so much a part of our Western tradition especially, that we live with it and we interpret it. The relationship between God and the world is not that of creator and creature, where the creator is out there and the creature is over here. The relationship between God and the world is that between deep structure and surface appearance. Scratch the surface and you'll begin to penetrate the deep structure. You'll begin to see the inner life which is the life of God that animates things and lives within all of reality. Judaism is a toolbox. It's a toolbox. It's a set of tools given to us to uncover that reality. The Jews of past generations, the ultra-orthodox today will tell you it's God's toolbox. God gave us that toolbox in order to do the work. Some of us may say it's the Jewish people's toolbox. It's the toolbox we inherited from tradition. I don't know who made the tools. It doesn't make any difference if they work.
Okay, well, I'm back. And I hope that was horrifying to you. He's calling it Judaism, but you see that he has done away with God. The relationship between God and the world isn't that of creator and created thing. It's that of, what did he say, deep structure and surface appearance. So he's done away with God. He's done away with anything resembling revelation. You know, some Jews will say that Judaism comes from God. I don't know where it comes from, but who cares? It's just a toolbox. Other people have other toolboxes. There's nothing left. There's absolutely nothing left. And yet, he is selling himself. Oh, I didn't give you his CV. Let me give you his CV, how he's selling himself. This is hilarious, guys. This is his CV. I'm not going to read the whole thing, okay? You'll see in 1968 he founded Havarat Shalom, an experiment in Jewish communal life and learning. Well, that coincided with when I went to university, so I was kind of a member of that group. Then he was for, about 10, 11 years. He was a theology professor. Then for about 10 years he was dean and then president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Now, I will talk about Reconstructionism next time, but the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College produces more ordained rabbis every year than any other seminary in the United States. So it's the biggest Jewish seminary rabbi producer in the United States. And he was the dean and then president. You just heard him say that there is no God. Even if there is a God, Judaism isn't from God. You know, and he was running the largest factory for producing rabbis in the United States for 10 years. But that wasn't enough. In 2003, he was invited to create a new rabbinical school at Hebrew College. Okay, the founding president dean of a new rabbinical school. Okay, so just please, guys, juxtapose.
God is real. It's the center of life.
Garbage.
This use of the word God has very little to do with the way most people understand
Judaism
the term.
Insulting nonsense.
Sometimes you almost feel it should be a different word.
But
the language of God, of course, is so much a part of our Western tradition especially, that we live with it and we interpret it.
And
the relationship between God and the world is not that of creator and creature,
boy, are they in deep doo-doo.
where the creator is out there and the creature is over here. The relationship between God and the world is that between deep structure
the straight
and surface
Hasidic Jews are left with...
Scratch the surface.
Now this is an overstatement, because
and you'll begin to
some
penetrate the deep
Lubavitchers
structure. You'll begin
didn't
to
follow
see
Schneersonism
the
aside.
inner life,
But
the inner
a lot
life
of the
which
straight
is the
Hasidic
life of
Jews are
God
left
that animates
with
things and
Schneersonism
lives
aside.
within all of reality.
The more modern
Judaism
neo-Hasidic Jews are left
toolbox.
with that pantheistic nonsense.
It's a toolbox. It's a set of tools given to us to uncover that reality.
Help. And don't forget, whatever
Jews
you do,
of past generations,
don't forget
the
this guy.
ultra-orthodox today will tell you what's going
Oh, I'm playing that clip again. Oh, gosh. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I was playing that clip again. I'm sorry. I hope I didn't disturb any of you. It's very disturbing. This is the guy it's all about, okay? This is the guy it's all... Oh, gosh. Maybe I'm playing it even now. I don't know what's going on. I really don't know what's going on. I'm sure I'm not playing it now. Anyway, this is what it's all about. Okay, I don't even know what I was saying. How can I start over when I don't know what I said? Oh, boy. Okay. Now I am sure that nothing is going on but me. Right? Right. Anyway, this is all for generating prayer for the conversion of the Jews. You know, look at what we have with that Artie Green business. I hope that I wasn't losing you with that stuff in the background when I showed you his CV. But this guy, Artie Green, who you heard that text from, that clip from, you know, the most important, you know, one of the most important Jewish authorities in Judaism today in the United States, as I said, the dean and president of the largest rabbinical seminary in the U.S. Turns out the largest number of rabbis, and that wasn't enough. He was actually invited to start his own rabbinical school as the founding dean and president and presumably theologian, and you heard his garbage nonsense. So this is the tragedy, one of the many tragedies of Judaism today, okay? And I'll talk about other tragedies of Judaism today. Actually, that's going to be the rest, actually, probably, of this series, because we're going to come up onto the Holocaust and all kinds of terrible wrong turns that were taken in Jewish theology. So let me just check if I got everywhere I had to get to. I think that's probably enough. For those of you who have a historical or philosophical bent, you'll probably recognize I call him Artie Green because, you know, when I was 14 and he was 21, he was Artie Green to me. He was a seminarian. I called him Rabbi Artie when he was ordained because I knew him as Artie. Anyway, we were hippies together. What can I say? Now he disavows any knowledge of me. But anyway, so that's that. It's been the greatest thing in the world to be a Jew in the Catholic Church. It's a great privilege to be able to share that excitement with you. So I'd like to close with a prayer. So let me close with a different prayer than the one that I prayed last week. I have to run off, of course, because thank God I have Mass. So here is a prayer. It's also fully kosher. I've used this before in the show. It's from the Catholic Breviary for the Week of Christian Unity. I have no photo of him with you. No, I have no photo of him with me. Come on, when you're a 15-year-old student, no. Besides which, you know, we didn't take photos in those days because you had to pay for them and have them printed. There were no digital cameras and there were no cell phone cameras. I mean, you did not take photos casually. They cost about 50 cents each to have developed and printed. Anyway, so let's close with this prayer. I'll try to recollect myself. O God, who manifests your mercy and compassion towards all peoples, have mercy upon the Jewish race, from the beginning your chosen people. You selected them alone out of all the nations of the world to be the custodians of your sacred teachings. From them you raised up prophets and patriarchs to announce the coming of the Redeemer. You willed that your only Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, should be a Jew according to the flesh, born of a Jewish maiden in the land of promise. Listen to the prayers we offer you today for the conversion of the Jewish people. Grant that they may come safely and soon, quickly, to a knowledge and love of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah foretold by their prophets, and that they may walk with us in the way of salvation. Amen. And that they may share all of the gifts, the overflowing bounty which you have provided for us in the sacraments of the Catholic Church and the teaching of the Catholic Church. Amen. So, with that, I will just go back to me and say thank you and goodbye. And I plan to make the next show on Sunday, and it will be on more on Judaism since the Enlightenment. Basically, it'll be on the Enlightenment's effect on Judaism and blah, blah, blah. The degeneration of Judaism from the heights, so to speak, of Eastern Europe, Hasidism maybe, in the 18th century, to the Judaism that was reflected in Rabbi Arthur Green and reflected in other streams of contemporary Judaism. So that's what that show will be about. You got me. I can't figure out why you guys are interested, but I'm really happy that you're still tuning in. So with that, goodbye for today, and I hope you join me again next time. And I'll go back to the opening screen, hopefully without Rabbi Artie and with the... let me just say one word about the music. The song is called Kol Nidre. It's the opening prayer of Yom Kippur. It's mournful because, of course, it takes place in the absence of the temple and the absence of genuine sacramental Judaism, which is acknowledged. And so it's kind of like, a song of exile by people who know they're in exile. But it's a performance before Pope John Paul II in the St. Paul VI concert hall, whatever they call it, auditorium in the Vatican, by an Israeli orchestra in commemoration of the Holocaust. So that's what that concert is, and that's what that song is. And that's why I chose to play it, because I just want all of you, if possible, to feel the tragedy and heart-wrenching quality of Judaism in the absence of the Jewish Messiah who came 2,000 years ago. So that's the point. Time to stop babbling.